July 30th, 1970. For weeks, Soviet pilots in Egypt laughed off danger, flying their MiG-21s with absolute confidence. Then, in just 3 minutes, 5 of their jets were shot from the sky. The story was supposed to prove Soviet dominance, but Operation Rimon 20 shattered that myth. How did the world's invincible aces fall to an enemy they underestimated? And why did this single loss mark the true breaking point of the Cold War in the Middle East? The answer starts with the arrogance that made disaster inevitable. In the summer of 1970, the Suez Canal became the front line of a global contest. Soviet air units flown in from bases across Eastern Europe landed in Egypt with a singular mission: to draw a line in the sand the Israeli Air Force would not cross. The war of attrition had already transformed the canal's western bank into a fortress, bristling with Soviet-made surface-to-air missiles, SA-2 and SA-3, layered in dense belts stretching from Port Said to Suez City. Soviet advisors numbering in the thousands poured into the region, reinforcing Egypt's battered air defenses and taking direct control of the skies. Officially, these were advisors, but in practice, Soviet pilots flew combat air patrols, scrambled intercepts, and even shot down Israeli jets. Their deployments followed a careful choreography. MiG-21 squadrons arrived through Black Sea ports to Alexandria, then dispersed to air bases at Beni Suef, Qom Ushim, and Qom Ashwin. From these runways, the Soviets enforced the so-called Red Line, a no-go zone stretching along the canal's length. Israeli incursions beyond this point risked not just Egyptian retaliation, but direct Soviet fire. The stakes rippled far beyond the Middle East. In Moscow, every move was calculated to project power without provoking a direct clash with the United States or NATO. American satellites tracked the expansion of Soviet surface-to-air missile sites, while Israeli intelligence intercepted radio chatter that revealed both confidence and contempt among the new arrivals. The Soviets viewed themselves as the armored shield of the Arab world, sent to erase the humiliation of 1967 and guarantee that Israeli jets would never again bomb Cairo with impunity. Within weeks, the presence of Soviet MiGs changed the rhythm of the air war. Israeli pilots, once bold, found themselves constrained, deep strikes were curtailed, and every mission was shadowed by the threat of advanced missiles and highly trained adversaries. The cost of miscalculation was steep. On June the 30th, 2 Israeli Phantoms were shot down by Soviet-directed surface-to-air missiles, a loss that sent shockwaves through Tel Aviv. Yet beneath the surface, both sides understood the unspoken limits. The Soviets wanted to dominate the air, but not at the price of igniting a superpower confrontation. Israel, for its part, sought to test the new order without triggering an all-out war. The Suez became a chessboard, each move watched by capitals an ocean away, every loss measured not just in jets, but in prestige and influence. Soviet pilots in Egypt followed a doctrine that left little room for improvisation. Every intercept began with a call from ground controllers, GCI officers sitting behind green-lit radar screens, plotting every movement over the Suez. MiG-21 fighters launched in stacked formations, each jet assigned a precise altitude and heading, trusting that the ground would always see what the pilot could not. The instructions were clear: climb fast, close on the target by vector, and strike from above. This system had worked in the skies over Vietnam and Eastern Europe. Here, the Soviets believed it made them untouchable. The MiG-21 itself was a symbol of that confidence. Capable of Mach 2, it could rocket upwards at nearly 60,000 feet per minute, and its small delta wings made it a difficult target at high speed. Soviet pilots boasted about the aircraft's ability to outclimb and outrun anything the Israelis could put up. Its Atoll AA-2 missiles were seen as the answer to any threat, and the cockpit's simplicity, just a gun sight, a basic radar, and a throttle, gave the impression that victory was a matter of routine. But beneath the bravado, the MiG's limits were real. In a turning fight, its radius ballooned to nearly a mile, and sustained maneuvers drained its fuel in minutes. The Soviets trained for quick kills, not drawn-out dogfights. On the ground, the culture of the Soviet advisory teams reinforced these blind spots. Pilots and instructors referred to Egyptian trainees as unreliable, often dismissing their caution as cowardice. Soviet crews joked in mess halls about how NATO jets would never dare cross the red line. This sense of superiority was woven into every briefing, every post-mission debrief, and every radio intercept picked up by Israeli intelligence. Confidence hardened into routine, and routine into arrogance. The final layer was trust in the system itself. GCI controllers, not pilots, made the decisions about when and where to scramble. Soviet crews responded to radar blips with the same confidence they brought to parade formations over Red Square. The idea that a radar return could be anything other than what it appeared, a lone reconnaissance plane or a slow-moving transport, never entered the equation. Every intercept became a test of doctrine, not instinct. In the summer heat of Egypt, the Soviets believed the sky belonged to them, and that belief would soon be tested in ways they had never imagined. Israeli engineers and planners faced a daunting problem. How do you lure the most experienced Soviet pilots into a fight they think they cannot lose? The answer came from a deep understanding of how Soviet radar and doctrine operated. Soviet ground controllers, relying on analog scopes and set routines, tracked targets by radar cross-section. The larger the return, the more likely it was to be a transport or reconnaissance plane. Israeli planners decided to exploit this by using their own aircraft as a living illusion. The bait would be 4 Mirage 3 fighters flown by the Israeli Air Force most disciplined pilots. They trained to fly so tightly together that on radar, their signatures merged into a single oversized blip. This formation, climbing to 35,000 feet over Egyptian airspace, presented itself as a slow-moving reconnaissance flight, an irresistible low-risk target. The Soviets, seeing what looked like a lone lumbering aircraft, would scramble to intercept, expecting a routine kill. Every detail of the deception was calculated. The Mirage's formation was so precise that Soviet ground-controlled interception radars, the P-12 Yenisei and the P-15 Flatface, could not resolve the separate aircraft. Instead, controllers saw a single, unusually large blip, echoing the profile of a high-value reconnaissance mission. To the Soviets, this was a familiar scenario, a target that had always proven vulnerable in the past. Timing was everything. The Israeli Air Force scheduled the bait flight just after a strike on Egyptian radar installations, knowing that Soviet controllers would be alert, but also eager to reassert control. As the Mirages crossed the Gulf of Suez and climbed north, the illusion held. The Soviets, confident in their radar and doctrine, vectored their MiG-21s directly toward the target. The mechanics of the trap relied on the physics of radar itself. A tight 4-ship formation at high altitude reflects far more energy than a single jet, creating an oversized radar cross-section, sometimes by a factor of 10. This was not electronic jamming or false signals. It was pure geometry and discipline, honed through weeks of rehearsal. Israeli planners had studied the response patterns of Soviet ground-controlled interception teams, noting that any large, slow-moving blip would trigger a swift intercept, especially after recent losses to Israeli reconnaissance. While the Mirages played their part in the sky, the rest of the ambush force, F-4 Phantoms, and additional Mirages waited at low altitude, masked by the terrain. The bait's apparent vulnerability was the final touch, drawing the Soviets out of their defensive shell and into the open. The entire operation depended on the Soviets seeing exactly what the Israelis wanted them to see and nothing more. In the operations room, Israeli engineers and intelligence officers watched radar returns in real time, confirming that the Soviet controllers had taken the bait. The formation's radar signature was holding steady, the MiGs were scrambling, and the trap was set. The stage was ready for a confrontation that would test every assumption the Soviets held about their own superiority in the air. Sinai's jagged spine, carved by ancient winds and sudden floodwaters, shaped the air war as much as any jet or missile. The ridgelines east of the Suez Canal, Mitla, Gidi, and the Ismailia escarpments rose in unpredictable patterns, throwing deep shadows across the desert floor. Pilots who had spent weeks patrolling at altitude now found themselves funneled into narrow corridors, their view of the ground broken by rock shelves and winding wadis. On Soviet radar screens, the world looked simple. A single slow-moving blip, the supposed reconnaissance flight, tracked north above the canal. Controllers at sites like Beni Suef and Kaum Ushim saw no reason to doubt their analog scopes, but the ground told a different story. The P-12 and P-15 radars, so effective at scanning the open sky, struggled to see anything flying below 500 feet. Earth's curve, combined with the sharp relief of Sinai's terrain, created blind sectors, dead zones where radar beams vanished into sand and stone. Israeli planners had mapped these gaps with care. Decades-old Soviet manuals, captured and translated after the Six-Day War, revealed the minimum elevation angles of each radar type. The Israeli Air Force's low-altitude routes threaded through these seams, sometimes hugging the deck at just 100 feet, sometimes cutting through dry riverbeds invisible to ground-based sensors. In the hours before the ambush, strike teams rehearsed every turn and climb, knowing that a single mistake would light up the radar screens and bring a swarm of interceptors. The geometry of the kill zone was as deliberate as the bait itself. The mirages, climbing high and slow, drew the MiGs out over open desert, but the real trap lay in the approach corridors, natural funnels formed by the ridges east of Ismailia. Soviet pilots, guided by ground control, dove in stacked formations, trusting that their speed and altitude would give them the first shot. What they could not see were the Israeli Phantoms and Mirages crouched below the radar horizon, engines throttled back, waiting for the signal to climb. As the MiGs crossed the canal and descended, the environment closed around them. The ridgelines that had once offered protection from Israeli strikes now hid the ambush force. Ground clutter, echoes from rocks, sand, and heat haze masked the signatures of jets flying just above the surface. In these moments, the landscape itself became an adversary. Soviet doctrine, built on the idea of perfect information from the ground, could not account for the chaos created by terrain. Pilots who had mocked their enemies for hiding now flew blind into a maze designed to strip away every advantage. Within the kill zone, seconds mattered. A MiG at 600 miles per hour covered a mile in 6 seconds, but the walls of the corridor left little room to turn or climb. The Soviets, confident in their routines, found themselves trapped by the very geography they had dismissed in briefings. The Mirage and Phantom crews, masked until the last possible moment, rose from the deck in coordinated climbs, their ascent hidden by the ridges until it was too late for the MiGs to react. The convergence of land and technology sealed the trap, not with electronic jamming or brute force, but with a precise understanding of how Earth and machine could work together to change the outcome of a battle. Inside the cockpit of a MiG-21, the world shrank to a blur of dials, heat, and the urgent crackle of radio traffic. Soviet pilots who had spent weeks in Egypt trading jokes about their invincibility now faced a reality that no training had prepared them for. The first warning came not from radar or command, but from the sudden flash of a missile streaking past the canopy. In seconds, the sky erupted. Explosions tore through formations. The sharp metallic taste of panic filled the air as cockpits filled with smoke and warning lights danced across control panels. Wings sheared off in mid-turn. Pilots who had trusted in their aircraft's speed and missiles now wrestled with controls that no longer responded. The MiG's famous climb rate useless against the Mirage's tight turns. Some managed to punch out, ejection seats firing them into the blistering Sinai sun. Parachutes bloomed above the desert, drifting toward rock shelves and dry riverbeds. Survivors later described the shock of landing in silence, the only sound the hiss of wind and the distant thud of another jet slamming into the sand. Others were not so lucky. Cockpits became infernos in seconds, engines flamed out, and the only escape was a desperate leap into hostile terrain. On the ground, the wreckage told its own story. Charred engines and twisted metal marked the spots where MiGs had come down, scattered across the barren landscape. For some, rescue came hours later as Egyptian patrols or Soviet helicopters threaded through the heat haze. For others, the ordeal stretched into the night, with little more than a survival kit and the knowledge that the sky, once a place of swagger and certainty, had turned against them. In those 3 minutes, the myth of Soviet aerial dominance was stripped away, replaced by the raw reality of loss and survival. Inside Soviet command posts, the aftermath of the Sinai ambush triggered a wave of urgent activity. Senior officers gathered around intercepted radio logs and scrambled for explanations, piecing together how 5 MiG-21s could vanish in a matter of minutes. Intelligence teams pored over radar tapes, searching for missed cues or evidence of Israeli deception. The initial shock gave way to a systematic review of every step that led the Soviets into the trap. Reports from the field arrived in quick succession. They included wreckage coordinates, pilot status, and fragmentary accounts from surviving ground crews. Each detail was catalogued and relayed up the chain, feeding a growing sense of vulnerability at headquarters. New directives arrived within hours. MiG-21 flight profiles were rewritten. Patrols would now avoid low-altitude dives near the canal, and they were to maintain higher, faster routes well west of the previous engagement zones. The old routines, stacked formations, deep intercepts, and reliance on ground-controlled vectors were suspended in favor of rapid egress and minimal exposure. Commanders ordered immediate reviews of radar coverage, demanding additional mobile units and tighter integration with Egyptian air defense batteries. Rules of engagement changed overnight. Pilots were instructed to break off at the first sign of ambiguity, and any target profile that deviated from the expected was to be treated with suspicion rather than aggression. Diplomatic cables moved in parallel. Soviet advisors in Cairo drafted classified memoranda for Moscow, outlining the losses and requesting reinforcements. Internal communiques debated whether to acknowledge the incident publicly or attribute the downed jets to Egyptian crews. The evidence was undeniable. Guncam footage, intercepted Israeli mission logs, and the physical remains of MiGs scattered across the desert left little room for doubt. Planners compiled a roster of source material, radar plots, after-action summaries, and pilot debriefs, preparing for high-level reviews that would shape Soviet air doctrine for years to come. The sense of control that once defined Soviet operations in Egypt now gave way to a sober recalibration, driven by the hard evidence of a system outmaneuvered. Air superiority is never permanent. Technology and tactics rewrite the rules in an instant. Today, every military strategist studies ambushes like this, knowing that overconfidence can blind even the most advanced air force. The skies remain a proving ground where certainty dissolves with a single miscalculation. In modern conflict, dominance is measured not by bravado, but by adaptability. What lesson do you see in these clouds? Share your thoughts below.